Hello and welcome to a Chapter 2 overview of everything that you need to know about the chemistry of life. Now, when it comes to the AP exam, there's three specific things that you need to feel extremely comfortable with when it comes to understanding different aspects of chemistry. How does the sequence and structure influence biological molecules? Why do living systems depend on water resulting from polarity and hydrogen bonding? And also, how do hydrogen bonds between water molecules create different specific intermolecular forces? So I have three questions right here that I want you to take a minute to look at and read over and think about whether or not you can answer them with specific evidence or facts or concepts learned in Chapter 2. So just take a minute here for you to read them over and think about whether or not you can answer differences between different types of molecules, polar bonds creating large-scale impacts, and why water supports life. So the first part of Chapter 2 just dealt with the topic of matter, and matter is just anything that takes up space and has mass, and we're going to start off with just elements and atoms. And different properties of matter come about by different atoms and elements combining. So sodium and chlorine, both toxic and very volatile, form table salt, which is thankfully not volatile and explosive and very normal and useful for life. So within the structure of the atom, I know we've talked about this quite a bit. You have protons and neutrons in the nucleus. Protons are positively charged, electrons are negatively charged, and they orbit in different shells. They repel each other and they're attracted to the nucleus. Now, within atoms, we have often this notion of isotopes. And isotopes are just atoms that are the same element, meaning they have the same number of protons. Maybe it's 2 if we're talking about helium. The difference is that they might have more or less neutrons than the normal stereotypical atom. And radioactive isotopes, because of these additional neutrons, tend to be not as stable. There's too many subatomic particles in what I call the VIP club, which leads to them decaying, giving off particles and energy. And we can use radioactive isotopes in medicine to target and also see things like cancerous throat tissue, or being able to measure the age of fossils in the ground. So just know that isotopes are atoms with different types of neutrons, but the protons stay the same. Now, because electrons are attracted to the nucleus, but also repelling each other, the distance from the nucleus determines their energy level. Generally, the further away you are from the nucleus, the more energy you have because you will have less electromagnetic pull. So in order to make electrons move outwards, we have to give them energy, and electrons lose energy as they move in the inner shell. Now, most elements are found in nature without a full valence shell of electrons. And valence electrons are those that occupy the outermost shell, meaning that they have the most freedom to begin with, they have the highest energy level, and they also occupy the most space. And that means those electrons, if not saturated in terms of the potential of that shell, tend to be very reactive. So atoms will form bonds to fill that void, to make their electrons have less space, and to bring about stability within the atomic structure. And the first type of bond that's really important for electrons forming bonds and sharing electrons to bring about stability is covalent bond. Co means community, together, so the bonds are going to be the atoms coming together. And they're going to do that by sharing electrons, where one or more electrons from an atom is going to be shared with the other atom, and vice versa. And when two or more atoms come together, they're going to form what we know as a molecule. So water is a molecule. CO2 is a molecule. And here's a couple different types of molecules that we can see. We can have hydrogen gas, where two hydrogens are sharing one of their electrons each to get to that 2. We can have a double bond between oxygen forming oxygen or oxygen gas, where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, all leading to 8. Whoops, we can have water molecules sharing one electron between a hydrogen and one between an oxygen. And then also something like methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, where carbon is sharing 4 of its 1 electrons, each with one hydrogen atom. Now, we can have different types of covalent bonds. A non-polar covalent bond is where atoms share electrons equally, and a polar covalent bond is where there is some unequal in the sharing. And that really has to do with how the atoms tend to attract electrons. And that usually comes about from having one very weak atom and one very strong atom in terms of their electromagnetic pull. Now, what this causes is a partial positive or partial negative charge for each atom. Let's see what I mean by that. So water is the stereotypical classic polar molecule where we have an oxygen and 2 hydrogen atoms. Now, oxygen could be described as a very needy, what's the word I'm looking for? It's an atom that has a very strong electromagnetic pull. It really wants those 2 electrons from hydrogen desperately. So that means the electrons tend to gravitate more in the space occupied by the oxygen rather than the hydrogen. At times, this hydrogen atom almost appears positively charged because there's no electron. At the same time, because oxygen is so much better at attracting electrons, it tends to appear negative or partially negative because those 2 additional electrons are occupying a space that normally oxygen would have 6 electrons and not 8. Now, the last type of bond that we can talk about are ionic bonds. And this is where there is such a strong difference between atoms' electromagnetic attraction to electrons that one atom is going to lose an electron or more, and another atom is going to gain 1 or more electrons. And we see this with something like sodium chlorine forming table salt. Now, after the transfer of electrons, the gain and loss, both atoms have charges because they either have a positive charge, they lost electrons relative to their normal atom, or they're negative because they gained electrons relative to their normal atomic structure. And we can see this here where we have a sodium, which is a metal atom. These always tend to be metals that lose electrons. And we have a non-metal, chlorine, that's going to gain that extra electron. Sodium becomes a positively charged ion. We call this a cation. Well, chlorine becomes an anion, a negatively charged molecule, and they form an attraction. Now, hydrogen bonds are not a molecular bond. They do not form within molecules, but rather they form between molecules. And this occurs when there is one molecule with a partially positive or negative charge, and another molecule is able to interact with that charge. Think about groups of magnets interacting with each other based on their charges. And we often see this in water as a result of oxygen or other types of molecules that might contain nitrogen. And we can see this where this partially charged water molecule with the partially positive charge with this hydrogen atom is able to form a loose association, a connection with the negatively charged nitrogen, which is also an electronegative molecule. And these hydrogen atoms here are all partially positive, so they could interact with another oxygen molecule with another water molecule. Now, the main thing to understand is that the shape is very important to the function of a molecule. Molecular shape determines how biological molecules not only recognize each other water molecule being able to interact with an ammonia molecule, but also how they respond to each other and how they influence biological properties. So I'm sure many of you play sports or have had experienced very high moments emotionally, and that is a result of your body being able to create endorphins. Endorphins have a really specific structure that are able to influence and target brain cells where there are receptors that give you those good feel vibes. So whenever your body creates a lot of endorphins as a result of maybe eating something really tasty, winning the lottery, going for a really great run, endorphins are released as a neurochemical that can make your brain cells fire and have those good feel emotions. At the same time, humans have been able to create synthetic morphine and a lot of opioid drugs that have the same exact structure here that allow us to elicit the same response. However, these tend to be far more stronger, leading to some positive consequences when it comes to maybe opioid addiction as a result of painkillers. Now, chemical reactions occur in the body as a result of different molecules being able to interact with each other, causing changes in energy. We're going to be talking about this a lot more in former chapters, but we need to know that within any chemical reaction, there are always reactants that cause a reaction forming products, and that often chemical reactions can go both ways. So I can combine hydrogen gas and oxygen to form water. This is really where people are thinking hydrogen fuel cell cars are the future of non-carbon intensive transportation. Or I could use water molecules to create oxygen and hydrogen gas. Now, all chemical reactions are reversible. I just talked about this. But the main thing to note is that chemical equilibrium is achieved when we have the same amount of reactions forming products, just as the products are forming reactants. So when these two reversible equations are equal, we achieve equilibrium. Now, I talked about polar bonds earlier in this video and how we have partially negative and partially positive charges interacting between different molecules. They're not forming any intermolecular bonds, so we're not having any electrons being shared. But these partially positive and partially negative interactions are quite a bit stronger than what we would find in nonpolar bonds, such as an oil or a lipid. So these bonds are strong, and they're keeping these molecules together. Not in a chemical sense of molecules forming, but in the sense that they're going to want to interact with each other far more than if they didn't have those charges. So because of water being a polar molecule and having these intermolecular functions, we see quite a bit of properties emerging from water that are really important for life. And those are cohesive abilities, the ability to moderate temperature, ice expanding when it freezes rather than shrinking, and the ability of it to be a versatile solvent. So water molecules are going to be formed by hydrogen bonds, and this allows it to create a property called cohesion. Again, remember that co means together. And cohesion is really important for fluids being transported throughout a body or an organism, because those water molecules want to stick together. And also, it allows it to have adhesion, which means water molecules can cling to another substance, maybe a vein or an artery in the human body, or the xylem and phloem of a tree when sap is being transported up or down in the spring or fall. And we can see that here during our March sugaring season, where cohesion and adhesion allow sap with some really tasty sugar molecules to go up a 100-foot maple tree, clinging to those cells, but also clinging to each other. The same thing is true for a human body. Imagine I replace this tree with a human body. Your heart is right here. Adhesion and cohesion is super important to get blood flowing back up the leg tissues, fighting gravity. Now, surface tension, is just a measurement of how hard it is to break the surface of a liquid. If any of you have ever jumped from a really tall place into a body of water or done a belly flop, you will know that water has quite a high surface tension, and that is related to cohesion, and it allows a lot of very interesting animals and organisms to adapt to in aquatic-based life, such as this wolf spider, which is non-poisonous, but you might see these in your house occasionally. They're quite big, nothing to fear, but right now, based on the distribution of weight and also the strong surface tension, this wolf spider is able to walk across water, as it would seem. Now, water is super important for moderation of large ecosystems because water is able to not only absorb heat from warmer air, but it releases that stored heat to cooler air. And if you're ever on a beach and you feel the direction of the air, whether or not it's leaving the land or coming into the land has everything to do with the differences in temperature. And this is due to the fact that water has a really high specific heat that can be traced back to hydrogen bonding. So when heat is absorbed, hydrogen bonds tend to break, but those bonds are a lot stronger than a non-polar liquid. Now, this means that it becomes very difficult to make water boil. Hence, we're able to absorb a lot of heat and store it and release it later on if the air temperature cools. And we can see this in California, where Los Angeles might only be 75 degrees because of that influence from the ocean temperatures. But if we move inland, suddenly we might see a 25-degree temperature swing because there's no water moderating these continental cities in their temperatures. Now, evaporation is obviously just the transformation of a substance from liquid to gas. So because water molecules are polar, it takes a lot of energy for water molecules to evaporate. And we call this the heat of vaporization. Basically, how much energy must be absorbed to make a liquid become a gas. Now, the water molecules that form vapor, steam, are going to be the most energetic. So as that liquid evaporates, the remaining water molecules are actually quite a bit cooler because they have yet to absorb that heat. That creates a cooling effect on our body. And this is really important for us stabilizing our temperatures when it comes to exercise or really high temperatures. As we sweat, that sweat evaporates, and that sweat that does evaporate is where we're losing heat. And the remaining sweat that is yet to evaporate is quite a bit cooler, which causes our bodies to experience a cooling effect. This is why you always want to stay hydrated and sweat during an athletic performance. As soon as you stop sweating, not only are you internally dehydrated, but your ability to cool yourself is really not in a good place. So you might have some heat shock to your internal organs, which is never a good thing. Now, obviously, you all know that ice floats on water because you've all had beverages with ice in it before. Water is one of the few liquids that has a maximum density when it is a liquid and not a solid. So when we see ice, we see an orderly hydrogen bond lattice that is not seen with water, which allows us to have ice float on water, which is really important for climate change. Ice is a really strong albedo reflector, which causes excess sunlight to be bounced back into outer space. Now, water is also really powerful when it comes to solutions. So anything that is able to um, dissolve into something is called a solute. And the solvent is the liquid that dissolves those solutes. An aqueous solution is one where water is the solvent. So whenever we're talking about aqueous solution, we're talking about a water-based solution with solutes that dissolve in water. And we can see this with a lot of different properties in molecules. So ionic bonds are able to readily dissolve into water because the polar bonds of water are able to separate the negatively and positively charged ions. And what that means is that we have positive or negatively charged oxygen molecules loosely interacting with sodium and positively charged molecules of water, these hydrogen atoms, interacting with the negatively charged chlorine. And the same thing is true for a much larger molecule, such as sucrose or a protein molecule, where those partially negative and partially positive charges allow these things to be interacting to a degree that allows us to form a solution. Now, one type of solution that's really important is acids and bases, and this is where water molecules tend to often, but not often, I shouldn't have said often, but not often, occasionally lose or disassociate to form hydronium and hydroxide, where there can be a water molecule that temporarily doesn't have a second hydrogen ion or has a third hydrogen ion. And this leads to solutions either having an excess of acids, this third hydrogen ion, or hydroxides, which tend to be the base molecule. Now, it is reversible, but what we need to know is that these two molecules are very reactive. Remember, we talked earlier about how atoms and molecules are reactive when they don't have a stable outer valence shell. This means that solutions that have an increasing amount of either of these solutions or atoms are very reactive. They tend to be not good for living organisms or systems. Now, acids are always going to increase the H positive concentration, while bases are going to reduce the concentration of H positive ions while also increasing hydroxide ions. So when we look at the pH scale, and this is really important just in terms of context, a neutral pH is a pH of 7, and that means that we have an equal amount of hydrogen and hydroxide ions, which means that the acids and bases are going to cancel each other out. As we move up or down the pH scale, becoming smaller and smaller, we tend to find more and more acidic environments where hydrogen ions tend to be more concentrated than hydroxide ions. So there isn't a canceling out property. And that's where we see things like battery acid, gastric juices, or the stuff in your stomach, lemon juice, being very acidic environments that can kill or be very volatile to life. And the same thing is true for very basic solutions where hydroxide ions are far greater than hydrogen ions. And this is where you might have household bleach or oven cleaner or household ammonia, all really toxic chemicals that are quite different than acidic solutions in terms of their chemical properties, but in terms of their effects on biological organisms, I wouldn't suggest either consuming battery acid or oven cleaner. Both are going to cause tissue failure and intestinal problems because of their volatility. Now, we have buffers within organisms that cause pHs to remain around a pH of 7, and buffers are used as ways to moderate slight changes in either acids or bases because organisms have a vested interest in making sure that their pH environment stay pretty stable. So for example, if you are exercising pretty frequently, carbonic acid is a buffer that's going to cause some stability in the human blood because you might be accumulating acids as a result of anaerobic respiration. So we can use this molecule to create more hydrogen ions to balance out the pH. Now, one further way that we can talk about changes in pHs is looking at a very large scale problem, which is human activities burning fossil fuels, which causes CO2 to be released. And we all know about that from a former science class. But what we need to know is that a lot of CO2 is absorbed into the oceans, which causes a change in the pH. Now, the CO2 that dissolves in seawater forms carbonic acid. And carbonic acid, again, is a molecule that's going to be donating excess hydrogens to the water environment, but also that is going to be lowering the pH. And what we tend to find is when that CO2 dissolves into the water and forms those excess hydrogen molecules, it forms a molecule known as HCO3, which is called carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid tends to steal away carbonate molecules. Carbonate is a form of calcium, which is really important for coral reefs and plankton. So what we've been observing in oceans all around the world is the dying off of coral reefs due to the lack of calcium carbonate in water, but also plankton, which forms the baseline fundamental food pyramid in the oceans, are tending to become weaker and smaller and less photosynthetically active because their exoskeletons can't have enough calcium carbonate. They're becoming weaker and less productive, which threaten ocean ecosystems. Again, thinking about what we just covered, which was a lot, you want to make sure that you understand these 3 questions. Please come to class with questions or email me, and have a great rest of your weekend.